Welcome, I'm Hernan Murdoch. In this episode, we're going to take a look at verbal communications. To help us get a better understanding about the impact of verbal communications and how to make them more effective as we are senders and to better understand and interpret them as receivers, we have with us Kathleen Crawford, who will help us better understand these dynamics. Welcome, Kathleen.
Hi, Hernan.
So, internal auditors spend a lot of time on verbal communications. Yes, a lot of time reviewing documents and data and files and so on, but a lot of time is also spent on verbal communications. So, help us better understand some of the nuances associated with it and what internal auditors should be mindful about, either as they are the senders of the message or the receivers of the message.
Well, this is such a vital topic for us to be exploring. It's much more complicated than we might even appreciate. We learn how to speak from a very early age. We learn how to listen from a very early age, but it's not always easy to get the proper meaning. And in order, especially when we're talking about testimonial evidence, and getting it right is not an easy thing to do. So I'd like to talk about this range of different choices that we have. In the context of auditing, we can discuss things with people through one-to-one meetings, group meetings. Maybe we, especially these days, are more inclined to use technology, so video conferencing, or we decide to cut through the clutter and pick up the phone and give somebody a call. We might participate in audio conferences. Any and all of these are absolutely workable solutions when we're trying to connect with somebody and ask them a question or opine on something. And then we have other types of communication at the bottom part of this graphic. We send that phone call and we don't connect, so we have to leave a voicemail message. Or we decide that it'll be simpler to send an email. And then later on in our audit life cycle, we send out different reports and correspondence. So these are all modes of communication that are commonly used in internal auditing. There are a few things that I'd like to point out here. You and I talk about this often, Hernan, like the disconnect that often happens when newer auditors are trying to get things done and they're not getting through to their client and they're not having effective communication. If we think about it a little bit more deeply, that's sometimes because the choice of which mode of communication they're selecting is not necessarily an effective one to use in the moment or in the context of what they're trying to accomplish. So first off, let's look at the fact that some modes of communication happen in real time. You referred to senders and receivers. So when we are the sender trying to ask a question or make a statement, make a request, if it's time sensitive, then you want to use a real-time communication like you see at the upper part of this list. If it doesn't matter so much, then that we can live with a delay, then leaving a voicemail or sending an email is perfectly fine. A lot of auditors like to use email because they think it leaves an audit trail. And yes, it does, but if you're trying to get things done, that's not the most effective way to go at it.
Right. Yeah. And then you can also have it go back and forth. So it's also going to create some delays in time as well, because now they're responding. Maybe they don't respond to the full question. They didn't quite understand what you're saying. So that can also delay the whole process.
Yes, absolutely. This list can further be divided when we think about things like the visual cues, the vocal cues, and the verbal cues that are embedded in these different techniques. So the ability to see someone face to face, we're going to talk about these three things a little bit later on in more detail, but let's just give a teaser for that here. The ability to see someone and read their facial expression and body language is paramount in some situations so that we can have a truer understanding of the meaning that someone is trying to convey to us, and they can have a better sense of the meaning that we are trying to convey to them. So the techniques at the top of the page here refer to techniques that include all three of these elements: the visual elements, the vocal elements. These are characteristics of the human voice.
Hmm.
and the verbal elements, the words themselves. As we move our way through the first tier and we strip away the visual, now we have a series of techniques that allow us to at least hear the voice. So phone calls, audio conferences, voicemail. And then finally, the words themselves have to do all the work in email, correspondence, and reports. So
That is so important because in many cases you lose the ability to provide tone and context, and you try to write everything down, and the nuance is not always coming through clearly. So that's where you have a lot of confusion, misunderstanding, and so on. So absolutely critical to be mindful about the thing that you lose when you rely only on text messages, whether it's
yes.
reports or emails and so on, that you're losing the ability to provide that context and that nuance, and tone becomes very difficult to do. Yeah.
Very, very true. Very true.
What are some of the other factors that we need to keep in mind as we look at communications?
So a few more things for us to think about are our formality versus informality. So what kind of organization are you working within, and what is the tone? You mentioned tone. What is the kind of tone that the organization sets? So I was in banking earlier in my career, and a couple of the banks that I worked for had a very formal tone, very hierarchical, and an expectation that we would comport ourselves in a particular way. And you would go through channels to meet with people, not just informally stop by their desk or their cubicle.
Hmm.
So the mode makes a difference in those types of situations. We can also think about culture and context, both in again, in an organizational sense, but we might think also about, are we working in an international context? So
Hmm.
how I might communicate as an American living in the United States might be quite different than folks are accustomed to in other parts of the world. So we have to be mindful of those differences and try to accommodate them. And I'm deliberate in saying accommodate them, because as the outsider who is part of the same organization but sort of set aside, I think that we get a lot farther if we will be mindful of those preferences, which leads me to
Hmm.
stakeholder preference. Some of your stakeholders may prefer meetings and interviews and other interactions at specific times of the day, or framed in a particular way. So we want to be mindful of that as well.
Very, very true.
Yeah. Then, as far as the audit evidence itself, we also have to be mindful of the level of documentation that we're trying to obtain. So having a conversation, a casual conversation with someone is all well and good. But if there are details that have to be confirmed, we might need to find a way to add to that and get some documentation to corroborate what the person said. And then there are the synchronous versus asynchronous. That's what the other graphic was really alluding to, as to situations where there's going to be a delay, or situations where we are communicating in real time. Synchronous is when senders and receivers are together in time, and asynchronous is when senders and receivers are separated by time. So how urgent is this situation? Do you need an immediate response? Is there some action that needs to be taken quickly? Or is this something that is sensitive enough that you want to get all the inputs? You want to be able to see someone's eyes, you want to be able to hear their voice, as well as the words that they use, and or you want to get that across. You know that if you sent an email, it would be quicker, but that back and forth that you referred to, Hernan, is very, very commonplace, and it can slow down the efficiency of the audit. So these are
Right.
all factors too.
Yeah, there are some cultural elements, and you mentioned some of those already as well when it comes to different countries and different cultures that those will represent. But even as far as age groups go, sometimes you have some differences there as well, where some age groups may prefer text-driven communications versus visual and so on. So we have to be mindful about what we tend to default to. And increasingly I hear from chief audit executives and managers about internal auditors who focus too much on email, and even had a term that I remember the first time I heard was quite interesting, called auditing by email, which is just basically firing emails left, right, and center, and not really reaching out to the individuals. And of course, now we have some constraints around the ability to travel or not, but even when you could, not getting up and walking over and talking to someone, or even picking up the phone. Now, there's one thing that's missing from that list, and that's instant messaging. And again, going back to culture, different organizations will embrace different things more than others, or consider different tools more appropriate than others. But as internal auditors, we should always check to see if that is considered an approved, let's call it approved, instrument or tool for communicating with the client. Within the department and within the team, most people will agree that instant messaging is fine. But when reaching out to the clients, you may want to check to see whether or not the culture considers that an okay process or tool, or if you want to go back to email and calls and video conferencing as more professional sounding, looking, feeling tools to use. So something to consider there as well.
Yes.
So let's talk about the elements as we bring the senders and receivers together, and we're sharing these messages back and forth. What are some of the considerations we need to keep in mind?
Well, if we take a look at the next graphic, there are three elements of communication. So think of it as, imagine that we are volleyball players or we're tennis players. The sender has the opportunity to send the ball over the net by incorporating stimuli within the message to evoke his or her desired effect. So the way that I frame my message, if I'm the tennis ball, sending the tennis ball over, have I delivered something that I'm making it easy for someone to return? So how high is that net? That's the distortion in the medium. With volleyball, it's pretty high. With tennis, it's a little lower, but you have to be skilled at the racket. So we're talking about using different techniques in different situations, depending on the distortion in the mode or the medium of communication that you choose, as well as our own ability to incorporate stimuli within the message. These two things are within the sender's control. The sender absolutely has control to take his or her time. Let's say we are going to send an email. We have the time. We should take the time before we press send to imagine how that might sound on the inner ear of the receiver. How is that going to come across? I like to use an example, a 7-word sentence. I didn't say she stole the money. If that's all that I sent to you in an email, how confident am I that you will interpret what I mean? Depending, if we just add the vocal characteristics, I didn't say she sent or she stole the money. It sounds like a denial. I didn't say she stole the money. Maybe I implied it in some way, but those words never passed my lips. Depending on which word is emphasized, there are 5 or 6 different meanings in those 7 words alone. So distortion in the medium in the context of email means paying attention and double checking before you press send to make sure that what you want them to receive is what you've actually sent. Because we aren't sure how sensitive your receivers are going to be. And that lobby back and forth, that coming back and forth could actually grow into something that is quite unexpected and very time consuming.
Yes, it can create a lot of misunderstandings, and then force the need to clarify and correct later. So yes, definitely a lot of risk to be concerned about and to consider. So think and choose wisely.
Absolutely.
So as we're thinking about the message, then what makes up the message? Because we've been talking quite a bit about the body language and what you see. You've also mentioned quite a bit about what you hear and the tone, and also the words themselves. So these 3 elements keep coming back, which I think is very important to reemphasize. But as we're thinking about the message itself, so what makes up the message and what do people usually lean towards when it comes to interpreting and attempting to understand what the sender sent? And I believe the term is decoding the message. So how does this process work in that sense?
Well, let's take a look at this graphic. According to Albert Mehrabian at UCLA, University of California at Los Angeles, he and his graduate students at the Graduate Language Lab did a series of experiments a number of years ago, and they were able to reliably predict or reliably assess what proportion of visual cues are in the message, vocal cues, and verbal cues. So the visual cues are what we observe with our eyes. Facial expression, body language. Viewers have probably noticed that I gesture a lot. So those visual cues are my baseline. If I suddenly put my arms by my side and I'm not engaging with my body, that's likely to indicate something has changed. So let's pay attention to the visual cues, what we can observe with our eyes. In fact, this is the highest proportion according to Dr. Mehrabian and his students. Visual cues account for 55% of the available content. That's more than half. So
Right.
reflecting back on what we were saying about these different techniques that we can use, we take away what someone can observe, and the vocal characteristics have to work that much harder. But think about what I said about email and reports, and you said about instant messaging. The verbal cues have to do all the work. The words themselves, which represent 7% when we're face to face, have to do all the heavy lifting. So the vocal cues are qualities of the voice, the human voice. So pitch and tempo and volume, and the way that the voice changes, especially as an indicator of emotion or interest and other sorts of things. And then the words themselves are the verbal cues.
Wow. So it's very interesting to see it numerically because in many cases we may intuitively assume that that is in fact the case. And when you sit back and reflect on your communications, quite often you see the body language and people will know that what the person is saying is not so. And as auditors, many times you also have to be mindful about, and this is very common guidance and advice as well for auditors, is to keep eye contact with the person you're talking with, because they may say something, but if they start to see them, maybe sweating a little bit, maybe getting, different shades of color in their face changing as we're talking about what happened to the money, the deposits that don't seem to show up, or the inventory that can't be accounted for, then you may want to see their symmetry between what they're saying and what their body is saying. And of course, like you said earlier as well, in terms of their voice, the inflection, the pitch, they seem animated or not, they seem protective, and so on. All of these dynamics are important for us to also discern. And it comes with practice and so on, but it's important for us to know that these things are really essential to fully understanding what's really going on and to be able to come with accurate conclusions, because we don't want to be unfair either. So this is a very important skill to work on. And I really appreciate the fact that you took the time to walk us through this, because this is something that we need to keep in mind. So as we go about doing our work, making sure we pay attention to the visual, make sure we pay attention to the verbal and then the vocal as well, and make sure that we are mindful of what we're saying and whether it is going to be understood. Thank you very much, Kathleen. I appreciate it.
My pleasure, Hernan.
If you like this series, subscribe to the ACI Learning YouTube channel to enjoy more audit-related content.